message out of it. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's National Press Club address, sponsored by Westpac. It's lovely to be here. My name's Catherine Murphy. I'm the political editor of Guardian Australia, and I'm also a director of the club. Now, today we're going to be talking about housing, which is one of those perennial debates in Australian politics. It goes around and around and around, and we never seem to arrive on many solutions. Now, we know what the problems are. Obviously, both buyers and renters are being priced out of the major metropolitan markets in this country. We also know that there's not even close to being a serious debate in this country about social housing and what we might need to do in order to improve that. So today, we're going to think about whether or not we can think of some new solutions that might help to reboot the debate. Now, joining me are two lovely guests. Just sitting beside me, we have Kate Colvin, who is the spokesperson of the Everybody's Home campaign, which is the initiative that we're launching here at the Press Club today. Then sitting beside her is Julian Disney, who has so many fingers in so many pies, it's a bit hard to say who Julian is, except obviously he's very well known to a national audience. But here today, he is appearing as in his capacity as the director of the Social Justice Project at the University of New South Wales. Now, if you're watching on at home, given we're talking about housing, I know people want to be all over it, so the good news is you can. If you're a Twitter person, you can shoot us some sort of a contribution by sort of marking our handle on Twitter, which is @PressClubAust. And when I say Aust, I mean AUST. You can also hashtag your contributions NPC, and then we'll see them. Anyway, without further ado, enough from me. Let's hear from Julian Disney, who's going to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks to the Everybody's Home campaign for inviting me to be part of the launch. Lack of affordable housing strikes at the heart of our lives, our communities, and our future prosperity as a nation. It impoverishes people, erodes families, destroys jobs, weakens the economy, and aggravates inequality. The last 20 years or so has seen a housing boom for many people, especially those who were already relatively wealthy. But those windfall gains have come at a very heavy price for many less fortunate Australians and for future generations. The victims include the many hundreds of thousands of households in unaffordable housing. Many of them are surviving only by incurring unmanageable debt, working excessive hours, or cutting other costs at the expense of their health and their opportunities in life. But there are probably about as many hidden victims who've only found affordable housing by living long distances from the urban centres in which most work opportunities and community services and sometimes their families and friends are located, or have not been able to find any home at all. Well, how did we get here? Why are our housing costs so high, and why have they increased so much in recent decades? Let's begin with economic policy. Increasing globalisation undoubtedly required greater responsiveness to international competition. But our governments have been too influenced by dogmatic obsessions with cutting tax, cutting government expenditure, and cutting government debt, even though in each of those three categories we are already very low by international standards. Instead, there should have been much greater concern and action about problems that are where we are more serious. We have more serious problems than in most developing countries. And some of them that stand out and are especially relevant in this context are exceptionally high housing costs and household debt, low investment by financial institutions in rental housing, and poor public transport infrastructure. Financial deregulation has been beneficial in some ways. For example, it helped to trigger competition and bring down mortgage rates. But eventually, too easy access to mortgage loans inflated house prices, especially through negative gearing, and led many people into dangerous levels of debt. The problem has been drastically aggravated in recent years by exceptionally and unsustainably low interest rates. Tax policy has also damaged housing affordability. A generally desirable tax on capital gains was introduced in the mid-1980s, but owner-occupied housing was made fully exempt. That inducement to pay higher costs for housing than one otherwise would have been willing to pay reinforced a pre-existing full exemption of owner-occupied housing from land tax, the abolition of estate duties, and an exemption of owner-occupied housing from the new means test on age pensions. And then an attempt to forestall excessive negative gearing was abandoned for thoroughly unsound reasons. A decade later, the general rate of capital gains tax was halved, helping to trigger a frenzy of negatively geared property investment. House prices soared as investors chased distorted tax breaks, outbidding people who were just wanting to buy a home. And the situation was aggravated by counterproductive grants to first home buyers. Instead of improving access to home ownership, these tax changes delivered large benefits to people who were already owners, especially the most wealthy, while helping to inflate prices beyond the reach of many would-be owners. The perverse but entirely predictable and predicted outcome of these allegedly favouring home ownership tax structures has been to reduce home ownership, not to increase it. That tax structure is in favour of current homeowners. It's not in favour of home ownership. Major changes in our workforce and labour market are also very relevant. They include the much greater involvement of women in paid work, a much higher proportion of jobs being part-time or casual than in the past, and very high by international standards, and much more frequent movement between jobs, whether voluntary or otherwise, than in times past. Those changes brought benefits for many people, especially many women, but they also fuelled competitive bidding up of house prices, especially close to strong work opportunities and quality childcare. Proximity to work and transport hubs is especially prized when both parents are working away from home. Major increases in the proportion of part-time or casual jobs, often outside normal working hours, has had a similar impact, and so is the shift towards high-paid jobs being in or near the CBD. Housing outcomes have also suffered greatly from government failure to invest wisely and adequately in long-term infrastructure. Public housing has fallen by almost 1/3 relative to total population, without commensurate support for growth in other forms of housing for lower income households like community or non-profit housing. Australia's relatively unusual patterns of urban development are also important. Our most populous cities cover much larger areas than most overseas cities with similar populations. Inadequate infrastructure investment in rapid and affordable transport options has gravely disadvantaged the rapidly growing number of people who can only afford affordable housing by living far from work and services. It's also important to note that by comparison with many other developed countries, we have a very low proportion of our population living in medium-sized cities, which the United Nations defines as 500,000 to 1 million. Housing costs are especially vulnerable to upward pressures if there are few attractive alternatives to the large cities. Yet government investment in regional city development, especially for transport and communications, has been grossly inadequate and often ill-directed. Immigration numbers and local planning systems are also very relevant in this context, but perhaps we can discuss those in question time. Well, why does all this matter? Kate will no doubt summarise many of the most direct and personal reasons why housing costs matter, including severe financial hardship for the most vulnerable people. So my role is to focus on some systemic and indirect impacts, which are often not adequately recognised. Inflated housing costs divert too much of our national savings and investment away from strengthening genuine economic development, especially away from industries that can provide long-term jobs and improve our trade balance with the rest of the world. Other areas of the economy have too often been held hostage by prioritising high house prices to bolster perceptions of economic strength and growth. The explosion of negative gearing has helped drive Australia's overall household debt to the top of the world ladder, 20% greater than our entire GDP. Only 4 countries have household debt above the value of their own GDP, and we're at the top. As well as increasing very many households' own vulnerability, this level of indebtedness, which is double what it was 20 years ago and double the OECD average now, has made Australia dangerously vulnerable to global economic downturns or a loss of interest by international investors. High housing and travel costs also damage our economy by increasing the pressures for wage rises, thereby threatening our productive and international competitiveness. Our biggest cities have become both larger in area and more congested with traffic than is economically or socially efficient. Essential services in inner urban areas, for example, find it harder to attract and retain workers like police, nurses and teachers who cannot afford to live nearby. A major advantage of being able to buy a home has traditionally been the degree of financial security that it can provide in retirement. Mortgage-free homeowners are much more likely than renters to be able to survive reasonably well on a pension or other limited income in their later years. They will also tend to be less at risk of having to move house prematurely. But house price inflation has hugely reduced the number of young people who can look forward to this kind of retirement security. Even if they do manage to buy a house, they will be much less likely than earlier generations to be able to pay off their mortgage before retirement. Long-term rental may provide a desirable flexibility for some people, but for many others it means perpetual insecurity and vulnerability. Inflated housing costs have also greatly increased the need for both parents in a household to work lengthy hours away from home. This can cause damaging stress in their relationships with each other and with their children. For sole parents, the stress can be even worse and the impacts on the children even greater. Concern is also growing about the adverse health impacts of high housing costs and poor urban development. They include the greater risks of obesity or other medical problems from sitting in a car, bus or train for very long periods each day, and similar risks arise when families with young children can only afford housing in small high-rise apartments or in houses which have no backyards or adequate recreational areas nearby. But one of the worst impacts of inflated housing costs is the growth in inherited inequality, surely one of the worst forms of inequality. It's increasingly difficult and often impossible for younger generations to buy a home without very substantial assistance from their parents or other relatives, if those parents or relatives have been lucky enough to share in the windfall, and of course also as long as the windfall hasn't been shared between too many siblings. The geographic dimension of inequality is also becoming worse. Deeper and sharper divides are developing between the wealthier and poorer areas of major cities. Neighbourhoods are less likely to be as economically and socially diverse, and as a result, their schools and community activities can become less effective at promoting interaction, understanding and transitions across sectors of society. These forms of growing inequality are already causing hardship in many lower income Australians and will affect a much larger number in future. But in turn, they are weakening the relative degree of social cohesion and tolerance, which has been a hallmark of the Australian community and is becoming even more important as our racial and cultural diversity increases. Well, what should be done? Kate will be speaking about the package of reform that's been called for by the Everybody's Home campaign, so I shall just briefly mention 3 key directions for reform that I think are especially important. The most important improvement that can be achieved relatively early is boosting the supply of affordable and accessible rental housing for lower income people, especially those who would otherwise be homeless. This is a special focus of the Everybody's Home campaign. Major government support is needed to regenerate efficient public housing, to greatly expand non-profit housing, and to incentivise large-scale investment in affordable housing by financial institutions such as superannuation funds. The second key direction is tax reform to reduce house price inflation and household debt. Not by drastic action, but by moderate changes with long-term effect. The best options are reducing the 50% tax discount for capital gains. That was a key factor in the explosion of negative gearing. Reducing the excessive tax deductibility for the expenses of landlords, which is the other key element of negative gearing. And reducing the exemptions from land tax or capital gains tax that are enjoyed by high-end homeowners. Whichever of those options is adopted should include removing stamp duty on modestly priced housing in order to facilitate entry into the market. Our tax system at the moment is upside down and back to front. It helps the richest the most, and it helps those who have already got in the market and have been in the longest, rather than those who are trying to get in. The third key direction for action is a sustained boost in infrastructure investment to improve public transport and strengthen regional city development. A key aim should be to take some of the pressure off our major cities by helping regional cities or urban clusters, in other words, cities that are close to each other and effectively interoperative, to achieve the economic and social diversity of a medium-sized city. It's important to achieve a degree of scale in these cities, and we haven't achieved it in the way that many other countries have. Indeed, for several decades at least, our national tax and infrastructure policies have been distorting development towards the opposite outcome. We suck people into the cities through our tax and infrastructure policies. We distort the market towards capital cities rather than being at best neutral. Well, governments and political parties from all sides need to take the lead here with urgent and sustained action, preferably bipartisan wherever possible, because this is an area in which sustained and consistent policy is absolutely crucial for the kind of long-term investment that we need. Failure to do so will aggravate personal hardship and family stress. It will weaken the economic and social strength of local communities and the nation as a whole. It will severely damage our economic development and competitiveness, and it will leave a deplorable legacy to future generations.
Thanks to Julian, and thanks to Catherine for that introduction before. I want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respect to their elders, both past and present, and to any elders who may be in the room today. We are in the midst of a homelessness and housing calamity. We've got homelessness that's increasing and increasing, and home ownership rates in decline. And more than 1.5 million Australians pay more than 30% of their income in housing costs. This is a calamity that has its genesis in decades of failed policies, misdirected government investment and inaction. But it doesn't have to be the way of the future. We can and we must tackle homelessness and housing stress. But it's time we stop waiting for change. We are launching the Everybody's Home campaign. Today in the room we have representatives of community housing, homelessness, welfare and tenancy sectors. We have banks and super funds and unions. The campaign has its strength in unity. And what unites us is that we have a vision for a fair Australia, an Australia in which everyone, every night has a place to call home, a place that is safe, a place to welcome our friends, to rest, to cook and eat, a place where children have room to play. These are basic fundamentals of life, but only a home can provide them. And we also believe that paying for the roof over our heads should be affordable. It must not leave our pockets so bare that we can't put food in the fridge. We need our homes, but we also need to eat decent food, to fill a prescription, to pay for clothes, transport, the costs of education. Australia is a great country. Australia is a wealthy country, and we can surely achieve affordable housing for all. But the reality is our housing system is broken, and it's government policy that has broken it. Speculators are driving prices out of reach. 1 in every 5 households, 1.5 million households, pay more than 30% of their income on housing. And 3 in 4 of those households are renters. I want to reiterate that point because the focus is always on home ownership, but housing stress is deepest in the rental market. Everybody's Home is our national plan for affordable housing to fix these problems. The plan has 5 key elements. Rebalancing the tax system, number 1. Increasing the supply of social and affordable housing. Number 3, strengthening the rights of renters. Increasing support for those, the capacity to pay for those who are in rental stress. And lastly, a national campaign to end homelessness. Most of these ideas have been aired before in some form, and they're based on models that have worked elsewhere. But what makes this plan unique is that it's connected and supported across the sector. I'm going to take you through each of those elements in a bit more detail, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end if you'd like more information. Firstly, tax. Australia currently forgoes more than $11 billion annually in negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, and it's now well recognised that those concessions tilt the property market in favour of investors. Labor has made welcome commitments to reform these taxes. Those tax reform proposals are on the right path, but they don't go far enough. We're calling on government to not only reduce the costs of housing tax concessions, but to also directly reinvest those savings back into the second part of our plan, increasing the supply of social and affordable housing. So to that second part of the plan, if there is a magic bullet to transforming housing affordability, it is to address the market failure in the low-cost end of the rental market by investing in low-cost rental housing. I'm going to say a little bit more about that market failure because it's so important. You know, the number of homes in Australia has grown, largely in line with population growth. But the problem is that those homes are not matched to households' ability to pay. So in many markets, we have too many high-cost properties and too few low-cost properties, and they don't trickle down. As an example of that, on census night, more than 1 in 10 properties across Australia was unoccupied. And many of those are brand new properties deliberately left vacant because of our tax settings. That's how speculators get best return in this context. So we need to address this mismatch between supply and the availability of that supply to those who need it by creating a body of low-cost rental housing that's targeted to those on low and moderate incomes and in housing need. So they could be key workers like nurses and teachers who can't afford to live near their workplace and, as Julian explained, spend hours each day commuting. Or it could be accommodation for young people who just want to move out of home, or for casual workers who are at risk of slipping into homelessness. So recent analysis indicates that Australia has a shortfall of 500,000 low-cost rental homes, and we are calling on government to deliver on that shortfall. That's a big number, but this scale of housing is necessary because it would release the current intense level of pressure in the rental market, creating more choice for all buyers and renters. It's not a quick fix solution. This requires a long-term commitment from government and, critically, a coherent national housing plan. It's simply just not possible to increase this scale of new housing without mobilising federal, state and local government to use the many policy tools at their disposal across planning, cities and infrastructure policy, taxation, investment and others. And a national housing plan would also have to include elements that are missing from housing policy now, like a subsidy to drive growth in 300,000 social housing opportunities and meet the gap between the cost of delivering that housing and the limited rental income that people on low incomes can afford to pay. And new incentives for super fund and other private sector investors to create 200,000 affordable rental opportunities. Recent research on the costs of financing social and affordable housing indicates this would need government to invest between $4 and $4.8 billion annually over 20 years. It's a substantial sum, but it is far less than our government currently forgoes each year, the $11 billion in negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, concessions that are simply making the problem worse. So we're talking about reducing the costs of concessions that are making the problem worse and spending on a solution that will fix the problems that we face. And our plan would create thousands, literally thousands of new jobs and drive economic growth across Australia. And unlike other proposals on the table, like $50 billion for company tax cuts, this plan would also reduce inequality and make our communities stronger. So to part 3 of the plan. Government needs to immediately increase Commonwealth rent assistance payments because these have been losing value as rents have risen much faster than CPI. And 4, we're calling on the states and territories to strengthen tenant protections by reforming their Residential Tenancies Act. And finally, we need a plan to make homelessness history. The plan needs to include concrete action to prevent and better respond to domestic and family violence, which is the #1 cause of homelessness for women and children. And government needs to make social security secure instead of endless rounds of cuts to Centrelink payments, another one of which is in the Senate at the moment with the Welfare Reform Bill. Instead of axing the remote Indigenous housing agreement, which is currently on the chopping block, we need government to house Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, who are 10 times more likely to be homeless than other Australians. And lastly, homelessness services must have the capacity to support vulnerable people who need help to gain and maintain housing. Currently, because of a lack of resources, homeless services turn away more than 250 people who need help every day. So these are the 5 parts of our plan. If you've been around Canberra for a while, I'm sure this isn't the first housing policy paper that you've seen. But today, the key difference is we are going to take our vision out to the community and give people the tools to demand our leaders take the housing crisis and homelessness seriously. Hundreds of organisations supporting the Everybody's Home campaign represent people from every walk of life. And we will work through these partners to reach their clients, their communities, their tenants, and give everyone the tools to demand real action from our elected representatives. And as the election nears, we will be calling on candidates to let us know where they stand on housing and homelessness. We will ask them, will you fight for a fair Australia? Here's what we know already. We know housing costs are a top-tier political issue. We know people are looking for leadership. We know we can make a difference. Ask everyone watching, pick up your phone, log in to everybodyshome.com.au and sign up to our campaign now. We must not miss this opportunity to fight for a more connected, more equal, more fair Australia, an Australia where everybody has a place to call home. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and as is our tradition at the club, we're now going to kick off a period of questions, and I will exercise the chair's prerogative and kick off. Just to you first, Julian, just because you spoke first. Now, you said, I think, I'm paraphrasing you, that the tax system currently is upside down and back to front, and it entrenches the interests of the wealthy at the expense of the less wealthy. We're seeing that diagnosis, I think, play out again and again in the sort of the tax debates that we're having between the major parties at this point. But I'm interested in understanding how we could coax the parties of government back to an holistic debate about tax, rather than seeing measures picked off one by one for revenue reasons or for some other driver. So it's a long-winded preamble which says how do we get the major parties of government back to a holistic tax debate. And also to Kate. Now, you've outlined that you're going to kick off a housing campaign, presumably between now and the next federal election, and you want to activate political representatives to change the priority in housing policy at this point in time. Obviously, the marketplace for those sorts of campaigns is entirely cluttered at this point in time. There is so much third-party activism happening, and it's great to see on the Australian political scene. My question to you is, how do you cut through the clutter, and how do you, in essence, use community-based organising and action to change priorities in Canberra? So, Julian, we start.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Well, I think the first step probably is for at least some parts of the political scene to be courageous in the proposals that they put forward, because I think they will realise that there's actually much more support and probably more importantly much less trenchant opposition to tax reform than they think. The desire for low tax, the demand by Australians for low tax, in my view, has consistently for several decades been overstated in politics. The surveys don't support it. Of course, it depends a lot on what the particular tax measures are, and one of the failures of both parties has been to get across that the major areas for change relate to taxation of assets, not to taxation of income. Wealth inequality is far greater, the order of about 10 times greater than income inequality, and it's also more damaging to the economy, actually. There's been too much of a tendency to equate tax reform with changes to the personal income tax scales, whether up or down, and they aren't the priority. I think that the experience of the Labor Party in the last federal election should give some support to the kind of approach that I'm talking about, where a courageous policy, and we've seen another one in the last week or so, doesn't appear to be as much electoral suicide as some people think. So I think that's the first step. The second step is to try not to be too ambitious. Although we need holistic tax reform, we don't need to try and do everything at the same time. Not only is that politically impossible, but it's also undesirable from an economic and social point of view. We can spell out a program over a period, which also frankly makes it easier politically. If you say, I'm not going to do this now, but I'm going to do it in 5 or 10 years' time. But we need to prioritise 2 or 3 goodies and so-called baddies in terms of their electoral impact in the first phase, but spell out roughly what's going to happen in the second and third phases. It's not easy, of course. We've had a tax summit in the past, 30-odd years ago, which did achieve some useful changes. I'm not sure that the environment politically now would make that a fruitful exercise. But perhaps the last thing to emphasise is that interaction between Commonwealth and state here is terribly important. Some of the most significant, some of the ways in which you can patch together a package which provides benefits and some things that people may see as disadvantages for them personally, involves cooperation between Commonwealth and state governments. And it doesn't necessarily need to be all state governments. If some state governments won't come to the party, so be it.
Okay.
So I think one of the things about housing is that it's one of those bread and butter issues. For most households, housing is the biggest cost that they face. And for 1 in 5 households, they're paying so much for housing that it's compromising other areas of their expenditure. So that's a massive constituency that's just looking to get on board right there. The thing is it's even bigger really than that 1 in 5 households who are suffering, because there's also all of those parents who might be in secure housing and are worried about their young their adult children who are struggling to move out of home. They're worried about how they're faring in the rental market. So I think that, really there's a massive constituency of Australians who are looking for a way to really communicate with their leaders on this issue.
But how do you get the government on board?
Well, one of the dimensions of the campaign is that not only will we give people petitions and what have you to enable them to communicate directly with, leaders, but we'll also be encouraging people to get out and go and visit their local MP. I think people often forget what an important aspect of our democracy that is, to actually engage locally with an MP and encourage MPs to work within their party to make sure party platforms are better.
Mm-hmm. Push out to the floor now. Our first question is from Canberra IQ.
Simon Groves, Canberra IQ. You both talked about the market, the housing market and tax, stuff like that, but you didn't talk about homeless people. I'm informed by a study published in the Medical Journal of Australia just this month, led by the Professor of Psychiatry at Macquarie University. And for the purposes of the discussion, I'll just go through some details. This is for people attending homeless hostels in Sydney over 8 years. They looked at, it includes about 2,400 people. 93% were men, so there's strong gender bias. 56% were receiving disability support pensions. 59% had been homeless for more than a year, so this is hardcore homeless people. 66% had substance abuse disorder. Psychotic illness 51%, acquired brain injury 14%, intellectual disability 5%. There's crossovers there. Pathways to homelessness included release from prison, 28%, discharge from a psychiatric hospital, 21%, and loss of public housing tenancy, 21%. So those three pathways, you add it up, it's 70%. Those three pathways go through existing social services portals. When you leave prison, when you leave a psychiatric hospital, and when you get kicked out of public housing or you can't handle it. Surely there's room to work on improving those social services so that you reduce the pressure, you reduce the number of people failing on that pathway. If you did that, then the market stuff, which is most of these people aren't going to hit that market. How do you deal with those problems?
Thanks for that question. That's really why we're calling for a national homelessness plan and not just for new homeless services. So homeless services are important, but people are coming into homelessness, as you say, out of prisons, out of acute mental health care. Children leaving out-of-home care are often discharged from a residential care unit into homelessness. And I think often people will be shocked to know that. So the solution there is actually to provide housing pathways. And there's been a lot of international research that's shown, I think traditionally people used to think if someone has a mental illness, we have to try and fix their mental illness before we can get them into housing. And what the international research shows clearly and consistently across country after country is that what we need to do is house people and provide support for them if they need it. So the housing is the critical central part of that, and that's what we're missing, and that's why we need a sort of multi-part plan that includes that housing, that includes that support, so where people come out if they're unwell and come out of acute mental health care, for example, they come into housing and have that support. If they come out of residential care in an out-of-home care setting, they come out of that. People are not ready, and particularly if they've been probably in out-of-home care, to be independent at 18. They might need some ongoing support as well as housing. But the other thing in terms of a national plan to end homelessness is poverty. So poverty drives homelessness because people don't have enough income to afford housing, as well as people not having housing that's affordable. So we need to fix these dimensions together, and that's why we call, as I said, for a plan.
Sky News.
David Spears from Sky News. Okay, just pick up on one element of your speech about teachers, nurses, those who can't afford to live near where they work, having to travel enormous distances. each day and the impact that has and so on. What you were talking about rental assistance for them near their place of work, or can you just tease that out a little bit? What you're actually calling on there, and not just rental, but also perhaps this has been done, I think, in other parts of the world. Allocating a certain number of units in a new development for the teachers, police, nurses, etc., to live near where they work.
Yeah, so there's a number of ways to deliver that housing, but what we're doing is making a distinction between social housing, which needs really quite a deep subsidy to house people who are on the lowest income. So public and community housing kind of falls into that. But also affordable rental housing, which, delivered well would probably be delivered by community housing, but which would have a lesser subsidy and be directed more to low, moderate income workers like teachers and nurses. So it would be about creating that kind of housing opportunities spread through a city so that someone who, and probably really, quite a lot of it in that inner and middle ring, because if you think particularly of nurses, a lot of our big hospitals, I know in Melbourne there's, 4 hospitals in an inner area, thousands and thousands of workers in those hospitals who are much better placed if they can live nearby.
Catherine, could I just add on
of
that?
course.
The National Rental Affordability Scheme, which was set up 10 years or so ago, was aimed at addressing this problem squarely, and it achieved considerable success, generating more than 35,000 affordable dwellings, 20% below market rate. And the nurses and teachers and police officers, etc., were part of the target, but not all of it. That scheme is a classic example of the need to stay the course. The current Treasurer did support that scheme in its early days, which was a good example of bipartisanship because it was introduced by a Labor government. It was implemented badly, and the politics of it were handled badly, and it came in at the time of the GFC, which, for reasons I won't go into, made it even more difficult to make it work, and yet it generated, it got up to the targets that we had in mind anyway when we proposed a scheme of that kind. Now, it was knocked off for completely inappropriate reasons. It could have been tweaked or developed in the way that we had originally suggested to attract funds from the superannuation industry in particular. But the main thing here is, as anyone in the housing business will say, is that you've got to give these policies time to develop. They can't be just chopped and changed for political advantage. And that scheme should have been reformed rather than abolished. It was the most successful at generating affordable housing, generated more, for example, than the stimulus money from twice as much as the stimulus money from the GFC. So we've got an example there that we should have built on, and we should return to that with an improved model aimed at precisely addressing this. This problem is far too great to be dealt with just by government money. What we need to do is energise the community sector, and that's happening a bit, but still not enough. But in any event, over the long haul, the scale of this problem is so great that it can only be done by bringing in private institutional investment. And that's, as I think I mentioned in my speech, one of the ways where we absolutely stand out as different from other countries is the lack of institutional investment in low-cost housing.
Guardian Australia.
Paul Karp from Guardian Australia. Just picking up on that answer, you've both mentioned the need for superannuation funds to invest in affordable housing. I wanted to ask both of you, what stops that sort of investment in affordable housing at the moment, and what sort of incentive is required to overcome that?
Well, one of the main things that stops it at the moment is that it just doesn't deliver an adequate return. And so that's why we're calling for a subsidy. So instead of having the current tax concessions which go into any kind of rental housing, is mostly landlords in that situation are mostly focused on getting a capital gain, so often churn properties over. The beauty of getting super funds in who are focused on building property to rent is that it's there for the long term. But it does need a subsidy to meet the costs of delivering that housing and the gap between the cost of delivering the housing and the income that can be generated from it, but not the same level of subsidy necessarily that you need for social housing.
I don't want to cut you off, Kate, but can you explain that subsidy a little better? Because I think for people watching on at home who would be thinking about their own superannuation funds investing in investments with lower rates of return, that's obviously that's an alarming thought for people. So what's the precise nature of the subsidy that you're proposing, and how would it address those concerns of account holders who think, oh gosh, I'd really just like a high performance investment? Thank you very much.
Well, currently investing in that kind of housing might generate a return, say, for example, of only 2%. And really, you know, if super funds are going to put money into a large investment, they're going to want 5 or 6%. So it's about meeting the difference between that on an annual basis. So I think we're really thinking of a subsidy that would occur over years, rather than, you know, a one-up kind of capital subsidy, which might be a good way of funding social housing. But, you know, I think that there's more innovative ways to bring in money from super funds. But Julian might want to add to that.
Yes, well, the National Rental Affordability Scheme that I was talking about was the proposal that triggered that, which came from a group that I chaired, was developed in close discussion with the superannuation funds over a couple of years to see how it could be made attractive to them. Unfortunately, it was not then implemented in the way that we had proposed, and the main weakness was in not attracting those institutions. But on the other hand, that was never going to be easy in the first few years. And one of the disappointments about what happened is that there was a huge change in the degree of interest in financial institutions in this over the life of that scheme. At the beginning of it, we found it very hard indeed to find anyone who was interested. By the end of it, I found that people who were right at the top of financial institutions, the head or the number 2, knew a lot more about it than their counterparts would have a few years before, knew what was happening overseas, in some cases were investing in it overseas. Australian superannuation funds invest in affordable housing overseas, but not here. The main problem, that the NRAS scheme did provide an ongoing subsidy, the order of sort of $12,000 a year for 10 years. So it wasn't a particularly low return product for superannuation funds, but also superannuation funds need a balanced package of investment. And they will be the first to say to you that they have a need in this kind of investment, fits a bit of a gap in their profile. That's one of the reasons why they try to fill it by going overseas. But the scheme was not developed in a way that enabled, you need to bulk up big offers. Superannuation funds won't get interested unless there's hundreds of thousands, maybe even, of dwellings over time being developed. And that requires a scheme which won't go into all the details, but which is implemented in a more market-savvy way than NRAS was for those people. It needs people who are finance brokers, who are used to attracting investment in activities, to be driving the government scheme. And that isn't what happened. And it also needs to be offered out. Instead of just saying, please come to us and tell us you know, what you'd like money for, it should have involved saying, this is what we want done, big tranche of housing over 10 years across this part of a particular city, put in your bids. Much more proactive in that sense. But there's strong interest there. The bones of the scheme are there, and incidentally it is to some extent similar with a scheme that was introduced by President Reagan, which is what, 30 odd years ago, when he in effect hugely reduced the scope for negative gearing by saying that you couldn't count the tax deduction against your salary or wage income, hugely reduced that. At the same time introduced a tax incentive for low-cost housing. That's exactly what, well, that concept is exactly what NRAS was aimed at and what we should do here.
2CC.
Thank you both very much for your presentation. Thank you, Catherine. Tim Shaw from Radio 2CC Canberra and a director of the National Press Club. It was Bob Carr, the Premier of New South Wales. He said on the 6th of March 2000, 6 months out from the best Olympic Games ever, Sydney is already full. Sydney and Melbourne are full. I want you to focus on the ACT, South Australia and Tasmania, both relatively small populations. The ACT Chief Minister says we want 500,000 living in the ACT by 2030. We've got a changing tax system down here in regards to stamp duty to more of a rates-based economy. So whilst your ambition of going national, maybe do you need to start in some of those emerging economies like South Australia, Tasmania, but specifically here in the ACT. The largest real estate agent is the ACT government. Building costs aren't the issue, it's the enormously high cost of land. Can I ask you both to draw your attention to that? How can government, in conjunction with superannuation firms, take advantage of that? And just recognising so many of those that service community members in the homeless sector, the second highest rate of homelessness used to be the ACT. It's now New South Wales. So what do you say to Tasmanian, ACT and the South Australian government about the opportunity ahead? Thank you.
Well, there's certainly opportunities there, but you know, it is easier to get affordable housing in a well-planned city if you're ahead of the game. I think too often governments get behind, they don't invest in infrastructure. So you could foresee a situation where, you know, the ACT government, South Australian government, as you say, growing population, put in those rapid transit links, put in other infrastructure that's necessary so that the housing can follow. But I don't think we can forget about the importance of getting affordable housing into those Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane kind of locations as well, which is also, can also be, you know, those situations can be improved likewise with good infrastructure. So it's partly a picture about getting housing on the ground, but also, as Julian was explaining, and might want to say a bit more about, but you can also achieve affordable housing outcomes by, you know, putting in a rapid train link to somewhere where there is more affordable housing, planning ahead, making sure you retain affordable housing in that location, and then people in that location can get to the jobs that they need to using that train link. So it's about infrastructure and planning to make our cities work for growing populations, not just populations growing and then saying, oh, it's all a mess. You know, you've got to keep ahead of the game.
A couple of comments. One is just following on from what I said about the National Rental Affordability Scheme. That's an example of where actually several states could get together in order to achieve the critical mass that's needed to put out a tender. So there are things, states I think sometimes tend to think that they have to run always to the national government for national or multi-state action. They don't. They should work more between themselves. But a broader point is, I think I mentioned in my initial comments that our tax structure and our infrastructure investment actively discriminate against development outside our major cities. To give you some examples, if a tax system hugely benefits capital gains, it attracts investors to go to the areas where the capital gains are the largest and the most certain, and that's in the middle of the biggest cities. That sucks investment artificially, because that's an artificial distortion in favour of capital gains, by contrast with other forms of investment. That sucks investment into the big cities and into the middle of the big cities. Similarly with infrastructure, many of our cost-benefit analyses, especially with the allegedly tighter but really very often misleading or misdirected alleged rigour of Treasury assessments of cost-benefit, unless you take a very long time frame, you get your cost benefits wrong. You continually, for example, it's cheaper to extend a sewage system around the margins of a city, than to put in a decent sewage system for a more substantial development outside. It's easier to just fiddle around with some train improvements on the outer fringes of a city than put in a proper intercity system. Our cost-benefit analyses are biased against long-term investment, by and large. Part of the very short time frame of political thinking, and I have to say very often media analysis. There's a famous photograph of the Sydney Harbour Bridge shortly after it was opened in rush hour, about 5 cars going over it, you know. If they'd done the kind of cost-benefit analysis we do now, it would have been a sort of swinging ropeway across Sydney Harbour rather than a proper bridge.
Well, that's a cheery thought. John Millard.
Thank you, Catherine. John Millard, freelance. Thank you for your addresses, Ms. Colvin and Professor Desney, and wide-ranging as they were well informed. Here in a major capital city in Australia, there are flats for the disadvantaged and poor, underprivileged people being systematically demolished and sold off to developers. where homes are found for the people that are being thrown out, if it's in the suburbs and they can find public transport, it's often unaffordable. Despite this, in this city, the high levels of homelessness and beggars on the street are well known. Despite this, we have a progressive left-of-centre government. I'm referring, of course, to Canberra. The question, do you have any questions or advice for this self-proclaimed left-of-centre socially responsible government?
To solve homelessness in Canberra? Yes. Yeah. Number one way to address that problem is to house people. So by getting more social housing on the ground so that people can have a pathway out of homelessness, then it's much easier to support people with the issues that they may face. And actually many people who are experiencing homelessness don't experience that many issues except poverty and not having a place to live. So, you know, if we can get people into housing, then you know, the problem essentially is fixed. And that's what countries overseas have done with great success. Finland, for example, you know, had a lot of people in shelters and over a period of time transformed those shelters into long-term accommodation. So instead of having people in temporary accommodation, you have them in long-term accommodation. Keep in mind, Finland also has you know, people have a decent income because they have a more robust social security system than us, and probably also have stronger mental health supports. But, you know, it can be done.
Could I just pick up on one aspect of John's question and put it to you both, just for a reflection? In Canberra, you know, referring to the trend John's talking about, which is the demolition of large-scale public housing, both in the city and along the major transport links. When I first moved to Canberra 20 years ago, one of the sort of high points of Canberra was the integration of social housing, both in terms of its priority placement and its integration through suburbs. How important do you both think that integrating social housing, both in sort of in high congestion areas and also through suburbs, is for, you know, is for solving the issue, that it's all integrated rather than where I grew up in the bush, housing commission homes were on the fringe of. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I think we're all the poorer if our communities are divided like that. So if we have all of the social housing in particular locations, then people don't have an opportunity to mix. They're not in the same schools, they're not in the same sporting clubs, they're not relating to people from a different walk of life, and that creates all sorts of challenges. As well, of course, we end up with cities where different locations in terms of service delivery are not at all equal. So, you know, in wealthier areas, we tend to have better public transport. We have schools that get more resources. We have all kinds of better infrastructure in those locations where wealthier people live, who arguably need those resources the least. And in the locations that are affordable where low-income households live, we have less resources, less access to public transport. So people have higher costs because they have to run more cars if they're working. And you know, and you have schools where you have a large concentration of people who are all experiencing disadvantage, and you know, that's not a great outcome on any measure.
Yeah, I think it's a crucial element not only of helping the people who are in public housing, but also the political acceptability of public housing and of support for it. It's often called a sort of pepper and salt approach rather than, you know, the huge monolithic towers, which is another example, I might say, of short-term inadequate cost-benefit analysis by public housing authorities, thinking that the most long-term economically and socially efficient way of doing it will be to pack as many people as you can into a particular footprint. Now that lesson has been learnt, but it's been learnt at the expense of public housing as a concept, which is not correct. That was a particular, and a lot of the problems of public housing, I have to say, are driven by the people who in government are often the biggest critics of public housing, namely people in Treasury. They have created an environment which has condemned public housing to being economically and socially inefficient by chasing short-term and illusory benefits rather than taking a longer-term approach. We do need public housing in addition to community and non-profit housing, and the sort of housing developed by the NRAS rental affordability scheme. Too much discussion, I think, often in the housing area sort of says, this tenure is the best way of doing it, this is the best place to live, this is the best kind of house to live in. That's not the right way to look at it. There's an enormous diversity of choice, just even in your lifetime. In my lifetime, I've lived in an enormous diversity of types of housing and places. It's not at all helpful to speak too much from the view that one way is the best way. And that's one reason why getting the fundamentals right, getting tax distortions, cost-benefit analysis distortions out of the system as much as you can, and then, you know, let a thousand flowers bloom. But you won't get that diversity, and you'll actually get the wrong kind of uniformity, if you have as many distortions as we have in choice. This is actually a lot of what we're pushing, in particular what I've been saying, is actually to do with genuine freedom of choice.
We've got time for one more from one of our directors, Misha Schubert.
Misha Schubert is the Director of the National Press Club. Thank you both for your address today. I'm wondering, I think a lot of Australians watching this would find it quite shocking that the rate of homelessness can have risen in a time of relative affluence in our economy and society. And you've given some clues as to some of the factors that you think have been behind that, but can I ask you both to put some kind of weighting on them? What do you think, is there a single biggest factor in all of that? And of those elements, is taking with respect what you've said around needing to have a comprehensive, holistic approach to this, but are there parts of that should be tackled first as a matter of urgency to really try and turn that rate around, heading downwards?
Yeah. So the number one issue that's driving homelessness is the lack of housing that people can afford to rent. And that's why the focus of the campaign is on delivering that housing, because it's about making sure that people don't end up homeless because that they can easily find somewhere to rent, but it also means that if people do for some reason end up homeless, they have a pathway out. But there's another, in a way, benefit of it that we've not explored that we started to go to in the last question, which was the question of choice. So the scale of new affordable housing that we're talking about would radically transform the low-cost end of the rental market. And that would mean more choice for renters to move between affordable housing and private housing and social housing as their circumstances changed. And it would also really potentially transform the relationship with landlords, because currently, I think it's around 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 8 households renter households live in a place where, they need urgent repairs. And that's partly about having no other choice. So if you fear to raise an issue with your landlord because you might get evicted and you know how hard it's going to be to find another rental property, people keep quiet. They don't raise those problems, just partly because they might get, slapped with a rent rise as well. So, if we can increase the choice, then that means they might experience homelessness in a very brief way. So, if you have to leave your home, if you're fleeing violence, if you have to go somewhere else, but you can quickly regain a new tenancy, then that's a very brief and far less problematic experience of homelessness than being homeless for a long time. And that's where only the housing can deliver that for people.
Yes, I think over the last decade or so, the problem of housing costs has become a more significant contributor to homelessness than it was in the past. There are a number of different factors, that can lead to homelessness. And perhaps going a fair way back, housing costs wasn't necessarily at the top of the list, but it's much higher in that list now. But also it's important in most social problems to bear in mind that prevention is at least as important as cure. And a top goal, not the top goal, must be to prevent homelessness occurring in the first place rather than just try to overcome its problems. And that's why, to me, as I said in my initial remarks, the clearest priority in my view, not just for homelessness but actually generally for the problem of affordable housing for low-income people, is these steps to improve the supply of low rental housing. That's where we can get the quickest and the best targeted improvements. When I say quick, I still mean 5 to 10 years in many cases, if we're to get real improvements rather than just going for illusory quick fixes. So that's number one. But sometimes a priority may be to take a step even though knowing it won't have impact for 10, 20, 30 years down the track. And that's why I would rank equally there the tax and infrastructure initiatives as well. Just to start, the fact that they are such major long-term problems makes it all the more important to start. And it is a mistake, I think, to think that, for example, as I think was said earlier, homeless people are not in the market, so looking at the market isn't important. Well, I don't think that's correct at all. You don't have to be in something to be very badly affected by it. And homeless people are very badly affected by the housing market. Incidentally, we probably shouldn't use the term housing market because it would be probably the most distorted market in the economy. And so people who say, "I'll let market forces rule," okay, well, they better get rid of the capital gains tax exemption for their owner-occupied housing. There are massive distortions in the market in the housing area. I'm not necessarily saying they're all bad, but you find that many of the apostles of allegedly level playing fields and no distortions will fight to the death to keep the distortions that suit them.
Now, speaking of market forces, we've got to think about broadcast forces, and we're way over, sadly. So join me in thanking our guests.